They said the statue began to bleed on a Sunday morning, just as the first hymn ended. A single drop of red rolled down the marble cheek of St. Agatha, bright against the gray light seeping through the chapel windows. By noon, the floor was slick with crimson streaks, and whispers spread faster than the rain outside. Some called it a miracle. Others called it a warning. But what if it wasn't either? What if the statue remembered something? What if it was reliving the pain carved into its stone veins centuries ago? 11 days it bled, and no one could make it stop. Why did every test come back human? Why did every camera lens shatter after capturing its face? And when the final drop fell, who was it weeping for? Who was it weeping for? By morning, news vans lined the gravel path to the chapel. Pilgrims knelt in mud while reporters whispered words like miracle and phenomenon. Inside, the air had thickened, the scent of iron and incense indistinguishable. Father Edmund refused to leave the altar, his trembling voice echoing through the nave. "Doctor." Rowan watched from behind the cordon, murmuring to himself about capillary reactions and pigment deposits. But none of it explained why the blood stayed warm, even after hours exposed to the chill. Sister Miriam wiped crimson drops from the saint's foot, her hands shaking. Each time she turned away, more appeared. Samples were taken. Results came back impossible. The blood type matched no known database. Under the microscope, it pulsed, alive. The scientists called for another test, but the vial shattered in Dr. Rowan's hand before they could begin. The wound healed almost instantly, leaving a faint red mark across his palm. Father Edmund saw it as proof of divine connection. Rowan called it an illusion. Outside, the rain never stopped. And within that endless drizzle, the statue continued to weep, as though time itself had forgotten to dry her eyes. On the fourth day, Sister Miriam claimed she heard whispering from the marble itself. She said it spoke her name in a voice that wasn't human. No one believed her until Thomas fell ill, his fever spiking whenever he came near the altar. The boy said he saw St. Agatha's eyes move, just once, just enough to know they had seen him back. Father Edmund begged for an exorcism. The bishop refused. Outside, the villagers prayed harder, their songs mixing with the storm's unending howl. By the 11th night, the chapel floor gleamed red-black beneath the moonlight. Reporters had gone, replaced by silence and the constant dripping. Dr. Rowan's instruments no longer worked. Batteries drained in seconds. Film came back blank. Sister Miriam prayed without pause. Father Edmund whispered that faith must bleed before it can be reborn, but when the final drop fell at dawn, no one was left inside except them. 3 witnesses to a miracle, or a curse no one would name. They sealed the chapel on the 12th morning. No pilgrims, no cameras, only the soft hum of generators and the quiet breathing of the research team. Dr. Rowan ordered full containment, samples, recordings, every measurable trace catalogued. Yet the air still felt wrong, thick and metallic, like something watching through the stone. Instruments buzzed erratically, readings spiked and vanished. Sister Miriam stood near the altar, whispering prayers between bouts of trembling silence. She said she could still hear it, the heartbeat beneath the marble. Rowan dismissed it as psychosomatic, but even he flinched when the blood began to rise again, pooling at the statue's feet without a single visible wound. Science demanded proof. The chapel demanded belief. Neither could sleep that night. Blood samples from the chapel were unlike any fluid Dr. Rowan had seen. Under magnification, the cells twitched, moving as though resisting analysis. Every centrifuge cycle ended with shattered glass. Every attempt to replicate the substance failed. Father Edmund called it a sign. Rowan called it contamination. Sister Miriam called it suffering. The sample temperature refused to drop below body heat, even when sealed in ice. Detective Holt recorded every incident, her voice steady, but her eyes betraying exhaustion. "If it's a hoax," she whispered, "then what's hoaxing us?" That night, the chapel lights flickered again, and the temperature inside rose, like the building itself was breathing. Father Edmund refused to abandon his parish. insisting the bleeding was divine intercession. Yet each sermon grew darker. He spoke of punishment, of penance, of saints who bled for humanity's pride. Villagers began to fear him, their faith cracking like the plaster walls. Dr. Rowan found him one night before the altar, barefoot, whispering Latin through bloodied lips. The statue dripped once more, a slow crimson thread winding down its chest. "You can't stop her," Edmund muttered. "She remembers." In that moment, even Rowan felt something stir. A pressure behind the eyes, a vibration underfoot. Whatever haunted this chapel wasn't content with miracles. It wanted witnesses. Detective Holt's investigation took her to parish records, older than the chapel itself. In brittle pages, she found an entry dated 1543. A nun sealed beneath the altar for heresy, accused of worshipping a bleeding saint, carved from her own likeness. The note ended abruptly, the ink smeared by something dark. When she returned to the chapel, the smell of iron filled the air again. Dr. Rowan's instruments registered a heartbeat frequency vibrating through the floor. Miriam collapsed, clutching her chest, whispering the name Agatha. Holt froze. The vibration stopped. Then, in the stillness, one drop of fresh blood fell from the statue's eyes. By the end of the week, faith had turned to dread. Scientists refused to stay overnight. Priests stopped praying. Only 4 people remained inside: Rowan, Miriam, Holt, and Edmund, each trapped by their own need for understanding. The chapel's generator failed at midnight. In total darkness, the air vibrated again, low and rhythmic, like a heartbeat against stone. The statue began to glow faintly from within, veins of red threading through white marble. Holt's flashlight died first. Then Rowan's recorder clicked off. Only Sister Miriam spoke, her voice trembling through the dark. "It's not bleeding anymore. It's breathing." The chapel reeked of rust and roses. After 11 days of bleeding, the flow had stopped. But the silence that followed was worse. Sister Miriam refused to leave, claiming the saint still spoke to her in whispers that came from the walls. Dr. Rowan logged temperature fluctuations and magnetic readings, his skepticism fraying with every pulse from the floor. Detective Holt kept her distance, marking every strange event with clinical precision, though the tape in her recorder warped each time the statue was near. Father Edmund's sermons had shifted entirely to prophecy. He spoke of judgment and rebirth, his eyes hollowed by sleepless nights. Outside, pilgrims gathered again, chanting prayers into the rain as if worship might keep the darkness from waking. As crowds gathered outside, fear turned to faith, and faith turned to hysteria. Villagers claimed their mirrors fogged with red fingerprints, that shadows near the chapel whispered their names. Holt ordered the ground sealed, but fences meant nothing to believers. They pressed against the windows, desperate for a glimpse. Inside, Sister Miriam trembled, murmuring that the saint had grown heavy with memory. Dr. Rowan, unable to sleep, examined the marble surface under ultraviolet light and saw faint veins branching beneath it, as though the stone had grown organic tissue. "It's not stone anymore," he muttered. Holt didn't respond. She was staring at the statue's mouth, watching it curl into something that could almost be called a smile. The bishop finally sent word: remove the statue, but no one dared touch it. Every worker who approached collapsed from nosebleeds or nausea. Rowan tried to rationalize it as airborne contamination, though his hands shook as he wrote the report. Father Edmund called it divine rejection, declaring that human hands could not move the sacred. In frustration, Holt placed her hand on the statue's shoulder herself. For an instant, the chapel filled with the sound of breathing, deep, resonant, collective. When she pulled away, her palm was smeared with red that would not wash off. That night, her recorder captured whispers even after it was unplugged. Sister Miriam began to change. She stopped eating, stopped speaking in full sentences, muttering only fragments of prayer. When Dr. Rowan examined her, he found tiny red streaks under her fingernails, identical to the statue's blood. "She's absorbing it," he whispered to Holt, who didn't answer. Father Edmund refused to let them touch her. During the next storm, the chapel's crucifix fell from the ceiling, landing inches from Miriam's knees without sound. When lightning struck outside, every candle extinguished itself, leaving her face faintly illuminated by the statue's red glow. In the darkness, she began to smile. By week's end, belief had curdled into panic. The statue's surface no longer bled, it breathed. When Rowan placed his stethoscope against the marble, he heard a faint rhythm, slow and patient. Father Edmund claimed it was the heart of God. Holt called it something older. Sister Miriam refused to move from the altar, whispering that the saint wanted to be remembered, that forgetting her was the true sin. Rowan tried one last test, drawing a line of chalk across the floor to measure vibration. It pulsed once, then twice, then cracked open slightly beneath his feet. From the fissure came warmth, and the scent of roses soaked in blood. The 11th night began without warning. No storm, no wind. Only silence so deep it seemed the world had stopped breathing. Sister Miriam knelt before the statue for hours, whispering fragments of prayer that dissolved into sobs. Father Edmund refused to rest. His sermons, now little more than fevered confessions, shouted into the still air. Detective Holt set up cameras in every corner, though none recorded longer than a few seconds before cutting to static. Dr. Rowan's final experiment, thermal mapping, revealed something impossible. Heat signatures pulsing inside the statue like a living body. The pattern matched a human heart rate. And then, at midnight, the first drop of blood returned. Not from the statue's eyes this time, but from its hands. At precisely 1 a.m, the chapel's organ began to play. No one touched it. Each note echoed like a voice underwater, deep and distorted. Father Edmund fell to his knees, tears mixing with sweat, as he cried that the saint was alive again. Holt's flashlight flickered, casting fragmented beams across the pews. Miriam rose slowly, eyes open but vacant, as if guided by invisible hands. She reached toward the statue's bleeding palms, her own fingers stained red from previous nights. "Doctor!" Rowan shouted for her to stop, but his voice drowned beneath the rising hum. The same heartbeat frequency that had haunted his recordings now filled the entire space. Then came the rupture. The stone floor beneath the altar split, hairline at first, then wide enough to expose black earth beneath. A warm draft escaped, carrying the faint scent of iron and flowers. Sister Miriam screamed, not in pain, but in revelation, claiming she could see a figure beneath, bound in chains of rusted gold. Dr. Rowan backed away, tripping over fallen instruments. Holt drew her gun, though she couldn't say why. Father Edmund stretched his arms toward the ceiling, declaring the world reborn. As the fissure widened, the statue's head tilted slightly, its eyes no longer carved stone, but glistening red orbs reflecting the candlelight. The miracle had become a wound. The air grew heavier with every passing minute. Electrical equipment sparked, metal bending under unseen pressure. Holt shouted orders that no one obeyed. Rowan tried to drag Miriam away from the fissure, but she clung to the altar with impossible strength. "She's calling," Miriam gasped. She remembers her pain. The statue's chest began to expand and contract like lungs. Blood bubbled at its lips, hissing as it touched the ground. Father Edmund's prayers turned into screams, words lost to static in Holt's failing recorder. When the lights finally burst, only the crimson glow remained, painting every trembling face in the color of life, or of loss. At 3:14 a.m., the chapel fell silent again. The fissure sealed itself as though inhaling. The statue stood still, its surface glistening wet. Miriam lay unconscious, her hands dyed red to the wrists. Father Edmund muttered a final blessing and collapsed beside her, heartbeat faint. Holt's gun clattered to the floor. Rowan, trembling, reached for the statue one last time. The marble was warm. Beneath its surface, something shifted, slow and deliberate. "It's alive," he whispered. Then the sound returned. Not the heartbeat, not the hum, but a low voice, speaking in a language no one could name. And from the corner of the chapel, the first candle relit itself. Morning came gray and soundless. St. Agatha's chapel stood sealed behind police tape, its door marked by holy symbols and warning signs. Yet inside, the air still pulsed faintly with heat, a rhythm only Rowan could feel through the floorboards. He documented everything. Residual temperature spikes, magnetic surges, faint voices caught in the static of his recorder. Holt wanted to shut it all down. She said it was over. But Rowan couldn't leave. He'd seen too much. Sister Miriam had not woken since the night of the fissure. Her pulse fluttered, weak but steady, as if echoing something buried beneath the marble. Father Edmund sat beside her, rosary clasped tight, whispering a prayer for a faith he no longer believed in. By noon, the investigators brought heavy machinery to lift the statue. Cameras rolled, officials watched, and Rowan stood by with trembling hands. The crane hooks fastened around the saint's shoulders, chains creaking under strain. But as soon as the marble left the altar, a low groan echoed through the chapel. Stone grinding against stone, or perhaps a voice. Sister Miriam stirred awake, whispering she's beneath. The machine's arm jerked violently. One of the operators screamed as blood began dripping from the ceiling beams. The statue dropped with a thunderous crack, splitting the altar clean in two. Beneath it, something metallic gleamed through layers of dust and bone. Underneath the altar lay a sealed cavity. A sarcophagus of blackened iron etched with Latin words, long eroded by time. Holt ordered the team to stop, but Rowan pressed forward. He brushed away grime to reveal an engraving, Agnus Sanguinis, the Lamb of Blood. Father Edmund trembled, whispering that the relic was forbidden, buried by the original founders to silence a heresy. Miriam rose weakly, voice shaking as she said, "She's not a saint. She's what came before saints." When Rowan pried open the sarcophagus lid, a gust of air escaped, damp and warm. Inside rested bones wrapped in crimson cloth, and a face sculpted from flesh that hadn't decayed. The relic inside was breathing. Every few seconds, the cloth shifted slightly as if something beneath stirred. Holt shouted to reseal the lid, but the hinges refused to move. The chapel's walls moaned under invisible pressure. Candles reignited one by one. Father Edmund collapsed to his knees, screaming that the blood was the world's penance. Sister Miriam stepped forward, eyes distant, whispering to the relic as though to a sleeping child. "You remember," she said softly. "You remember all our sins, Doctor." Rowan backed away, realizing the blood on the statue had never been dripping down. It had been rising up. The earth itself was bleeding to feed what was buried. When the final candle extinguished, the chapel plunged into darkness. Holt's voice vanished from the radio. Rowan's recorder emitted only a low, rhythmic pulse. The sarcophagus lid began to close on its own, grinding metal against stone. Father Edmund crawled toward it, pleading for forgiveness. Miriam whispered that the saint's suffering was done, that she had taken back her pain. Then, as the iron seal locked shut, every window shattered outward, releasing a storm of ash and blood-colored rain. When silence returned, the statue was gone. In its place, a hollow impression glowed faintly red. The tests were over. What remained could not be studied. It could only be feared. 2 weeks passed. The chapel was sealed again, its broken windows covered, its altar draped in heavy cloth. Outside, rain continued day and night. The ground turned to red clay. Official reports cited structural collapse, yet no one dared retrieve the relic. Dr. Rowan stayed in Calvarin Hollow, his notes filled with trembling handwriting and stains that would not wash off. Detective Holt submitted her final report, but couldn't explain why her dreams smelled of iron and roses. Sister Miriam had vanished from the hospital without discharge. Only Father Edmund remained confined to his bed, repeating one phrase to the nurses: "The silence isn't peace, it's waiting." And beneath that silence, deep under stone, something pulsed. Rowan's nights grew unbearable. He played the recorder from the chapel again and again, trying to isolate the pulse hidden in the static. On the 12th playback, he heard it. A whisper beneath the hum, speaking his name. The sound grew clearer the longer he listened, like a heartbeat that wanted to be heard. His apartment lights flickered each time the tape reached the moment of silence. He tried to destroy it, but every time he burned or snapped the cassette, it reappeared on his desk by morning, slightly warmer to the touch. By the third night, he stopped fighting it. The whisper had changed. It no longer called him by name. It said, "Come back." Detective Holt's report was rejected. Too many contradictions, too much superstition. She requested reassignment, but the department psychiatrist insisted she rest. That night, she dreamt of the statue standing in her living room, its marble palms open, dripping sound instead of blood. When she awoke, her shoes were wet. She tried to laugh, but her reflection in the window smiled a moment too late. She drove back to Calvarin Hollow at dawn, rain streaking her windshield. As she parked near the chapel, she saw someone at the altar window. Sister Miriam, eyes open, unmoving, watching her through the glass. Inside the chapel, dust hung thick in the air, yet the altar was spotless. Holt moved slowly, gun lowered, flashlight trembling in her hand. Footprints, bare and small, lolled from the door to the pedestal where the statue had once stood. In the silence, she heard faint humming, a melody she recognized from the organ that had played itself. The boards over the windows rattled softly. She turned and saw Miriam standing near the pews, expression serene, eyes black and glistening. "She forgave us," Miriam whispered. Holt stepped back, heart pound. "Forgave who?" Miriam smiled. "The ones who carved her name away." At sunrise, the chapel doors were found open. No one inside, only the sound of dripping from the altar. Water, not blood. On the wall behind it, carved freshly into the stone, were 11 vertical lines and one horizontal slash through them, like a tally. The 11th day had come again. The investigators sealed the place once more, but the scent of roses lingered, and the sound of a heartbeat could still be felt if one pressed an ear to the ground. Dr. Rowan's apartment stood empty. Holt's car was never recovered. Only Father Edmund's final journal remained, a single sentence scratched across the last page: "Miracles don't end. They rest between breaths." 43 years later, restoration crews arrived at Calvarin Hollow. The chapel had been condemned for decades, its walls choked with ivy and moss. They came with drones, scanners, and plans to turn St. Agatha's into a historical museum. The air inside was still thick, metallic. The workers joked about the legends, about the bleeding statue and the vanished priest, but the laughter never lasted. In the dim light, the altar looked darker than stone should. When they pulled away the rotted boards, one worker cut his hand on a sharp edge and swore he saw the wall breathe. Blood fell from his palm onto the marble floor and disappeared instantly, absorbed without a trace. They stripped the cloth from the altar and uncovered the sarcophagus, still sealed, iron fused with stone. No tools could open it. No torch could melt its edges. One worker joked that they should leave it alone, but the site manager insisted. The first hammer strike echoed through the chapel like a gunshot. From the rafters above, a shower of dried petals rained down. The second strike cracked the lid slightly, and warm air spilled out, smelling faintly of roses and rust. Instruments malfunctioned. Power flickered. The manager ordered them to stop. But it was too late. The fissure had begun to breathe again. The crew fled, but one camera kept recording. Its footage showed a figure standing where no one had been, a woman in a tattered habit, her face pale and still, eyes black as glass. She walked slowly to the altar and knelt, placing a single rosary bead on the cracked sarcophagus. The air shimmered as the floor absorbed it. Then the feed went white. When investigators reviewed the footage, they froze on the final frame. Sister Miriam, exactly as she appeared in 1978, unaged, unmoving, her hand resting on the iron lid. The timestamp read November 11th, 11:11 p.m., precisely 43 years to the minute since the bleeding began. When the team returned days later, they found the chapel empty. No tools, no equipment, only dust arranged in human outlines across the floor. The sarcophagus stood open now, its interior hollow and dry. A faint heartbeat could be heard if one leaned close, coming from beneath the floorboards. Among the debris lay a single audio recorder, its reel still spinning though it carried no battery. The recording played the faint sound of dripping water, then a voice, not Miriam's, not Rowan's, not Holt's. It whispered the same phrase over and over. "We are still bleeding." The chapel was sealed again, this time permanently. Calvary Hollow became another ghost story, whispered by locals who never enter the valley after dark. Yet, sometimes hikers report faint red light glowing through the chapel's broken windows, pulsing in time with the wind. Scholars say it's reflection from nearby traffic. The villagers know better. They say the statue returned. Different now. Its marble smoother, its face changed. Those who look too closely swear it bears a new expression, not of pain, but of patience, waiting. Because miracles, once they begin, do not end. They only sleep until someone remembers them.